The head of the UN's nuclear watchdog warns military action is posing serious risks to the Kursk nuclear power plant. Moscow says a facility in Russia has been attacked by Ukrainian forces. Kyiv hasn't commented. So how dangerous is the situation? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bayes. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency warns there is a risk of a nuclear incident from fighting near the Kursk nuclear power plant in Russia. During a visit, Rafael Grossi said its nuclear reactor has no protective shield, meaning there's a high risk of disaster if it's hit by a missile. Ukrainian forces crossed into the Kursk region just over 3 weeks ago, and the fighting has moved closer to the facility, putting it well within range of Ukrainian weapons. Nuclear risks have been a constant since the start of the war in Ukraine. Russian forces seized the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine, the largest in Europe, early in 2022. It's since been attacked several times, with the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, visiting the site and issuing warnings there too. So how serious are the dangers at the Kursk plant, and could the fighting nearby lead to a nuclear catastrophe? We'll be talking to Mr. Grossi, the IAEA's Director General, in a few minutes, and our panel of guests after that. But first, this report from Wilson Dysart.
With Ukrainian forces only 40 kilometers away and their weapons well within range, the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog visits the Kursk nuclear power plant. President Vladimir Putin has accused Ukraine of trying to attack the nuclear facility, one of the largest in Russia. Ukraine hasn't commented. Rafael Grossi warned of the danger of a serious nuclear incident.
We see the plant still operating, but at the same time, the fact that the plant is operating make it even more serious in terms of an eventual action against it. When a plant is operating, the temperature is much higher, and if there was the case of an impact or something that could affect it, there would be serious consequences.
Grossi said the reactor lacks any special protection. He had seen evidence of a drone strike on the plant's premises and repeated his warning that nuclear facilities must not become targets in armed conflicts. But Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman accused the IAEA of not being explicit enough in its observations.
We see both the assessments and the work of this structure, but each time we want a more objective and clearer expression of the position of this structure. Not in favour of our country, not in favour of confirming Moscow's position, but in favour of facts, with one specific goal: ensuring safety and preventing the development of a scenario along a catastrophic path, to which the Kyiv regime is pushing everyone.
Russian forces have occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine since early in the war. It's since come under attack, with the IAEA confirming a reactor building was among several parts hit on April the 7th this year. A scenario few, if any, want to see repeated in this less well-protected nuclear facility in Kursk. Wilson Dysart, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Mr. Grossi is now back from Kursk and at IAEA headquarters in Vienna. Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, thank you for joining us here on Inside Story. As we've seen, you've just returned from the nuclear plant in Russia. What concerned you most?
Well, what concerns me most is the situation of a nuclear power plant, very close to an active combat zone. In this case, after the recent military activity and the incursion of forces from Ukraine into the territory of the Russian Federation, now we have seen the possibility of a nuclear power plant within range of unmanned area vehicles or artillery. And of course, this is always something that, irrespective of the territory, the country, or or other circumstances, this is always something that concerns us because it has to do with nuclear safety and security. And this is why I personally led a mission by the IAEA there, which took place yesterday.
Director General, this is an old design of nuclear plants. As I understand it, it's very similar to the one at Chernobyl, which was the scene of that awful nuclear disaster in 1986. My understanding, the technical term is a containment dome, but basically it doesn't have a hardened roof. That's the problem. Just tell us, what is the scenario if something was to hit it, if a missile or drone was to hit the reactor? What would happen?
As you rightly say, most nuclear power plants have their core protected by a metal structure, inner vessel, but then on top of it, reinforced dome, which is prepared to resist even the impact of an incoming aircraft, to give you an example. In this case, because of the type of design, of course, the reactor is inside the building, but this building is a normal building.
So what would happen, Director General, if it was hit? Would it be like Chernobyl or worse?
If it was hit, there would be, unlike in a normal nuclear reactor where a hit on the reactor would most probably never get to the core of the reactor with the fuel and the nuclear material is, in this case, it would directly impact it. You must remember that this type of reactor, if you refer back to your memories of Chernobyl, is moderated by graphite, so combustible. And then we could have potentially, I wouldn't use Chernobyl as a parameter, but in terms of the intensity of what could happen, because it would depend on what kind of projectile would be impacting. But in any case, there would be an important radioactive release into the atmosphere. So it really constitutes a very serious situation, again, in case there was an impact of that nature. So this is why it was important for me to go to evaluate the state of the reactor, the emergency and preparedness and response mechanisms in place. And of course, have the possibility to have the IAEA, in case there was such eventuality, which of course we hope would not take place, able to respond to it and to inform the international community about it. So this was a first but indispensable contact with the situation there that I had to make.
Okay. We know that you were shown what the Russians said was drone debris. They say, the Russian Foreign Ministry, that you should be more explicit in condemning the Ukrainians. But how do you know that that really was drone debris from the Ukrainians? And do you have any fears that your visit is being used for Russian propaganda?
Not at all. I mean, intentions by others is not something I would get into, motivations or intentions. Otherwise, I would not be able to do much in the international arena these days. So what's important is what the IAEA does and what the IAEA says. And we see things, we consider them technically, we evaluate. Obviously, at the time of these events, they refer to a couple of occasions recently and as part of the recent military activity, which they attribute to the other side. Of course, we were not present there. We were not able to make an evaluation at the time, so we cannot point fingers. What I have said, and again, what we say is what counts, is that all of this cannot be separated from the events taking place in the area. So this is why it's important that the IAEA gets involved, and it's important to reaffirm, as I did yesterday from Kursk or earlier at the United Nations Security Council, there should never be an attack on a nuclear power plant. This is the principle.
And as you know, there's a very worrying symmetry to the situation because the Kursk plant, which is not currently occupied by Ukraine, is in Russia. Zaporizhia nuclear plant is at the front line in Ukraine, and that is occupied by Russia. How worried are you at the moment about Zaporizhia too?
Well, I will be visiting Zaporizhia next week, and hopefully also Kyiv, and talking to President Zelensky, with whom, of course, we have a very important agenda, referring to Zaporizhia, referring to the protection of the other nuclear power plants in Ukraine, which at the moment are the lifeline of the country, because they are at a moment where the as you know, energy infrastructure of the country is under stress. These nuclear power plants are providing reliable energy to the economy and to the society. So we are going to be discussing that and other things.
Okay, Director General, given the symmetry that I've talked about, the fact that there is a nuclear power plant on the front line in one country and on the front line in the other, does that in any way give you an opportunity for potentially some diplomacy with both sides?
Well, I would say the similarities of the situation, it is tempting to draw this kind of parallel, but the situations, as you rightly said, are very different. In one case, we have territorial issues, we had an occupation, we have a situation which is very different from here, Kursk, where we have a plant which is in controlled and disputed territory of the Russian Federation, which lies close to an advance of military troops from the other side. So if you want, the common denominator is the nuclear risk, or the risk of a nuclear accident, to put it correctly. Diplomacy is always deployed, and this is why, as you know, because we have been talking before, the IAEA is the only international agency talking to both at the same time, because there is an obvious recognition from both sides of the importance. These are two very important nuclear countries, nuclear in the sense of nuclear energy, civilian nuclear energy. Of course, Russia has nuclear weapons and Ukraine does not. But there are countries that rely heavily on the contribution of nuclear energy to the national respective grids. So, of course, this makes it for repeated opportunities to talk, to persuade, to hopefully influence things for the better.
Great to speak to you again. Director General Grossi, thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, let's discuss all the issues with today's panel of guests. In Vienna, Robert Kelley is a distinguished associate fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and a former director of nuclear inspections in Iraq for the IAEA. In Astana, Elena Sokova is the executive director of the Vienna Centre for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. She specialises in the Eurasia region and international nuclear safeguards. And in Washington, D.C., Anatol Lieven is the director of the Eurasia programme at the Quincy Institute, a US-based think tank. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us, a regional expert and two nuclear experts. I hope the scientists will correct me if I get anything wrong, because I don't claim to know a lot about nuclear science. Let's start with you, Robert, though. You heard the interview with the Director General of the IAEA, the agency that you used to work for. Russia is saying that the IAEA needs to be much more explicit, condemning the drones that were fired on this plant. Ukraine is saying this is all Russian propaganda and it's not even their objective. Does the IAEA have any capability to look at those drone debris and say who was responsible?
When I worked for the IAEA, they had zero capability for that. They don't have capability for assessing nuclear weapons, for example, either. So that's not their strong suit. What I found really depressing and amazing about this conversation is it's all wrong. The the Kursk facility is nothing like Chernobyl, and to even by innuendo suggest that those two are related, you cannot have the accident that was at Chernobyl. It's impossible. Why the IAEA, which is supposed to be the most important nuclear technical agency in the world, is putting out hysteria and garbage is beyond me. For example, the containment building around the reactor that you have in many reactors wasn't there to stop airplanes. It's there to contain radioactive steam if there is an accident in the core. If a drone hits that building, chances are all it will do is just destroy itself on the outside of the building.
So just to be clear, just to be clear to us, a direct hit by a missile or a drone on the reactor. What, in your view, what would it mean?
Well, we're talking about one artillery strike or a drone strike will probably damage the outside of the building. The core is extremely rugged. It's inside a strong building, just not a containment building. But the containment building would not be there to protect the reactor. It's to keep steam and radiation from getting out of the building. That's what's missing in that 40-year-old Soviet design.
Elena, you are our other nuclear expert. Do you agree with Robert's view on that?
First of all, I want to clarify that I'm not a nuclear energy engineer or nuclear physicist. And it's difficult for me to make certain technical and scientific recommendations regarding that. But the fact that the building does not have a containing reactor, a containment over the reactor, it certainly makes it much more difficult to contain the radiation if there is a release. But it also makes the building less protected from potential impact, depending on what kind of missile or airplane is used. But my understanding is also that in addition to many of the features that were added after the Chernobyl accident, there are also additional safety features that put into each reactor. It's not only about this containment building or cap or dome or reactors. So if we are talking about comparing potential of accident, I would say it's definitely much, much lower than the case of Chernobyl. Having said that, any release of radiation or any damage to a reactor or its core would be a very serious radiation incident, and it would put the development of nuclear energy and overall developments around nuclear power into a much more difficult situation. But I want to go back to the comments regarding the ability of the IAEA to make assessment of the drone attack or the remnants. I think that the fact that Grossi pointed himself, that's not their job and it's not their expertise. The IAEA specialists are not forensics experts, particularly when it comes to conventional weapons. And the fact that they are sometimes expected to provide or point fingers or make assessment is asking for something that the agency and its personnel are not equipped and not prepared to do so.
Okay,
so
let me bring Robert back in, because you were critical a moment ago of the IAEA. Mr. Grossi, Director General Grossi, was leading this mission. He's been leading so many of the IAEA's missions to Zaporizhia. Is this unusual? Is it normal practice for the head of an international agency like this to be leading the field trips?
Well, we didn't have any field trips to Iraq, and we didn't have any field trips to Libya. We had technical people go and work those problems. So I think the main thing I'd like to see is that a technical person and not an international lawyer speaks for the IAEA and tries to reassure the public. I think Elena just did a nice job of pointing out there are a lot of differences and try to reassure the public that this is not any chance of being anything like Chernobyl. There's zero chance that Kursk is going to be another Chernobyl. There may be radiation releases if something goes wrong, more likely in an outside fuel plant, but not there. So when you look at Zaporizhia, they keep talking about the reactors, but they're huge outdoor pools with no cover on them, filled with thousands of radioactive fuel elements. That's where we should be putting our attention.
OK, let's get the context from Anatol. It's 3 weeks now since this offensive started. Do we have any indication that Ukraine actually wants to capture this nuclear plant? Because they had the element of surprise, very weak defences when they first went into the Kursk region. They could perhaps have captured it right at the beginning if they wanted, couldn't they?
Possibly. It's not really possible to say how far they could get. I'm sure they wanted to get as far as they could. The question is, I think, how determined are they to hold this territory in Kursk? There have been indications from the Ukrainian government that they really see this as a bargaining counter in eventual peace talks. But on the other hand, some military experts have suggested that this, rather than an advantage for the Ukrainians, could be a very dangerous distraction from the defense of their own territory in eastern Ukraine. I'm afraid that to a degree we're now operating in, what is called the fog of war, and we will have to see how things turn out on the battlefield.
But Anatol, how things are turning out on the battlefield, yes, they're making gains in the Kursk region in Russia, but when you look at the situation in Ukraine itself, in eastern Ukraine and Donbass, it seems to be going pretty badly, doesn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, that is a key point, because one might have expected that faced with this surprising and pretty humiliating Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, that the Russian government would have thrown everything into Kursk to push them out again. But in fact, they've only deployed troops to contain the Ukrainians in Kursk while continuing their offensive in eastern Ukraine to capture the town of Pokrovsk and the southern Donbass oblast. So the Russians seem, to a degree, not so concerned about this Ukrainian attack. And people I've talked to have expressed considerable confidence that, if only incrementally, time is still on Russia's side. And as one Russian security expert said to me, sooner or later the Ukrainians will have to leave Kursk, but we will never leave the Donbass.
Robert, let's move to eastern Ukraine and the other nuclear site that we've been looking at for 2.5 years, Zaporizhia. You said you're not quite as concerned as many others are about Kursk. How concerned are you about the situation at the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, where there has been fighting at various points? It's under the control of the Russians, and it's, I believe, a much bigger plant than the Kursk plant.
Zaporizhia is a much bigger plant. Most of it's been shut down now for months. That doesn't mean it can't still have melting incidents or hydrogen incidents, but it's in much better condition now than it was. You have to worry about those outdoor fuel ponds that I mentioned, because that is where radioactive material is stored underwater with no cover, no building at all over it. There's no containment building. There's no nothing. Those things are just underwater outdoors. Then you have to look at the other plants in the Ukrainian arc there. They have 3 other sites where operational reactors are. The Ukrainians are going to be very, very careful not to cause any kind of a radiation incident at Kursk, for the simple reason that the Russians have left their nuclear plants in Ukraine alone up to now. And if the Ukrainians cause a problem at Kursk, it gives the Russians a green light to take out all of the rest of the electricity production in Ukraine, and they're going to freeze to death this winter because there'll be no electricity at all. Rafael alluded to that.
Elena, we know from President Zelensky that one of the aims of the Kursk operation is to strengthen his hand in potential negotiations. Do you see any prospect for a start to that being some nuclear diplomacy, given we're talking about one plant in Ukraine, one plant in Russia? Could there be some sort of opening here, do you think?
I think the incursion of Ukrainian forces into the Russian territory itself probably is an attempt of having an opening of a discussion, though we still don't know exactly what are the reasons and possible several reasons for this incursion. But I don't think that the nuclear plants are the key point here. I think it's overall the attempt to shift the situation with the war and demonstrate Ukrainian ability to fight and actually fight and get into even Russian territory. But again, we don't know everything and we don't have enough information about that.
OK. Anatol, can I bring you in on this point? Do you think that there is any room for diplomacy on the nuclear issue itself? I attended that summit that took place in Switzerland that Ukraine had with the international community, didn't invite Russia. And it's worth looking back at the declaration. The very first point was about the international community's concern about nuclear installations and the fact they should be, I quote, safe, secured, safeguarded and environmentally sound.
Well, I mean, so far there have been, for more than 2 years now, no direct contacts between the Ukrainians and the Russians at all, except a very limited area of prisoner exchange. So if you could get a limited dialogue going on nuclear safety in Zaporizhia and Kursk, well, that would be a very small beginning of talks, because sooner or later there will have to be direct talks. And actually, the Ukrainian side has now changed its previous position and said, yes, at some stage there will have to be talks. But the nuclear issue could only be a very small beginning or opening. You know, you cannot resolve all the colossal issues between Ukraine and Russia and the Western Russia through nuclear negotiations. Look, it's obviously much more significant than the so-called ping-pong diplomacy that began relations between communist China and the US.
OK,
in the
Anatol.
1960s.
Anatol, thank you very much. Thank you to all our guests today here on Inside Story. Anatol Lieven, Elena Sokova and Robert Kelley, and also to Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, who joined us earlier. Coverage of Ukraine and Russia continues here on Al Jazeera, with analysis too on aljazeera.com. If you have comments about this story or any other, we want to hear from you on Facebook. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or on X, you'll find us at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the whole team here in Doha, please keep yourself safe. I'll see you back here very soon. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.